We'll get more into the NBA playoffs right now. He joined us for the first round of the NBA playoffs a couple weeks ago. Now he's back for the second round of the NBA playoffs. He is Jonathan Von Tobel joining us right now on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline. Of course, we have Nets versus Bucks tonight, Game 1 on 97.3 ESPN. Tomorrow, Sixers versus Hawks. We'll get into all of that and more. Jonathan, how you doing today?
I'm good. You know, I'm wearing the Clippers hat, and I'm hoping I can throw some good vibes to my guys. The Los Angeles Clippers come back and eventually win this series. But it's been a good postseason. It's been a lot of fun, a lot of good storylines.
So before we get into that, I want to touch on a topic that you were talking about on your podcast this week, the Hardwood Handicappers. And that is, I've talked about this with my audience before, and it's about, and I know it's an overused term, but it's the idea of finding value, not just making bets for making bets, right? You know, people are like, oh, I want to play. And you were talking about the fact you were like, well, I don't know if Anthony Davis is playing or not, so why am I going to make a play without limited information? And I think a lot of people are asking me the same question. Well, what if Embiid plays or doesn't play with the Sixers? And I'm like, well, obviously there's different ways that series can go, and I think that people don't understand that you don't just throw money out there when it comes to sports betting. You got to make an informed decision. I think sometimes we overlook that when it comes to sports betting because people assume, oh, well, you guys are sports guys. And it's like, well, no, we're not wasting our own money, so we're not going to tell you to waste your money.
Right. You know, it's funny. It's an old cliche when you talk about sports betting, but sometimes the best bet is not making one, right?
Right.
You know, your biggest weapon as a handicapper is the fact that you don't have to bet on every single one of those games, but a bookmaker has to book every single one of those games. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. And that Suns and Lakers series, especially toward the end, is a perfect example of why in the world you would want to. I know a couple of people who saw that Anthony Davis was going to play and was like, I'm in. And I thought, I was like, well, you don't even know how healthy he is. You just know that he's going to play. And sure enough, what happens? He goes out there, looks nowhere near, I don't even think 20%, is grabbing at the groin, doesn't look healthy. Sure enough, one play, he goes down to the floor and never comes back, and they lose that game. So you're absolutely right. People do want plays, you want action, that's fine, but you got to make educated decisions about a lot of these bets, and sometimes the best bet is not making one, especially in circumstances like this Philly-Atlanta series, where, I'm looking up reports early this morning to see if there's been any update, and there isn't. We don't know if he's going to be there for Game 1, Game 2, or any part of this series.
Well, that leads me to my next thing, which is, here's the interesting thing with me with the Sixers. So the Sixers keep calling him day-to-day. Obviously, he's practicing, kind of. He's what they're calling working up a sweat is the term they call it. Now, every person I've heard from, we've had multiple doctors here on 97.3 ESPN. I see people on TV. Everyone says this is a 2 to 4 week injury. So my working theory right now is I don't think he plays until Game 4 at minimum. I think they get the full 2 weeks out of it. He obviously is wearing a knee sleeve after he got the MRI. So obviously this is partially a pain thing than it is an actual injury thing. So with that kind of information, do you approach a series like the Sixers and Hawks and just say, how about we just assume that Embiid isn't going to play and we evaluate it that way?
You could, right? But at the same time, like, we saw what Anthony Davis did, right? Like, these guys do believe, obviously, and it's the playoffs. It's very important that there's probably going to be an effort to play through pain or play to a certain extent where they probably shouldn't. Come back slightly earlier than they probably shouldn't, because at the end of the day, well, it might be, hey, we might not be available at the beginning of the series. You might need them, right? There's a Hawks team that's playing extremely good basketball that's gotten very good since Nate McMillan has taken over. I tend to think that in the postseason, guys will come back slightly earlier than expected on a normal injury because they think, one, it's the machismo factor, but it's the other is these are important games. We need our best players out there type of a deal. And like it's hard too when you look at this, because I will say that, when you look at a series price, for example, right, it's hovering around $2. Some spots are just under the $2. You could go into that thinking, but at the same time, if it's going to be that way, like it should probably be a little bit cheaper. I feel like there's so many different ways to look at it where it's too many unknowns that I would just not feel comfortable handicapping it one way or the other,
I hear you. I mean, for me, I've already made my pick. I'm going Sixers and 7 because my working theory is that either what's going to happen is all the home teams are going to win their games because we know the Sixers are really good at home, the Hawks are really good at home, or there's going to be a split somewhere along the way. It's going to be a best of 3 at the end, and maybe Embiid comes back in the end. Because to me, at the end of the day, my theory on the NBA so far right now, you tell me what you think about this, Jonathan. Jonathan Von Tobel joining us here on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline on 97.3 ESPN, at MeJVT on Twitter. I think the way to win almost every series in the NBA at this point is let the other team's best scorer just do what he's going to do. You're not stopping Kevin Durant. You're not stopping Trae Young. You're not stopping Bradley Beal. You're not stopping Damian Lillard. But if you can stop everyone else and limit their ability to win, you can win. The problem is you got to have a good defensive team to do it. I think the Sixers are a good enough defensive team to actually execute that.
Yeah. I think each situation is unique, right? Like I would argue that Portland tried to do that. Nikola Jokic scored whenever he wanted. He averaged about 30 points in that series, and he ended up winning that thing, right? So every situation is unique. But to your point, Denver, I don't know if they allowed Damian Lillard to do it or Damian Lillard just did it because he's incredible, averaging well over 35 points per game in that series, decimated them, and they ended up losing that game in 6. But I thought that was more of defensive liabilities on the Portland side than anything else. But you do see that strategy to a certain extent. You could very much argue that in that Hawks series against the Knicks, Trae Young was absolutely fantastic, but the ancillary pieces were also great too. Bogdan Bogdanovic in crunch time was absolutely incredible. Clint Capella destroyed him on so many of those lobs and those pick and roll situations. So to an extent, that's probably going to be the strategy. But like, what do you do against a team like Brooklyn, right? Where arguably all three of those guys are like their best scorers on any given night. So it's pretty tough from that standpoint when you're looking at it if a team, if you're willingly allowing the best player to score points. Now, I think a team like Brooklyn might need to do something like that because they don't really have an answer for Giannis Antetokounmpo. So now it's about shutting down the other pieces around him. So I think every situation is unique when it comes to that strategy for sure.
So overall, you mentioned about how you're going to bet some of these series. So in your opinion, when it comes to the two Eastern Conference series, Sixers, Hawks, Bucks, Nets, I personally think it's going to be Sixers in 7 and Bucks in 7. So, but how are you approaching it in terms of, Are you betting hard? Are you betting light? Are you kind of letting it play out? Like, talk to the audience a little bit about some of the things you talked about on your podcast. I thought your strategy was very interesting. You said, listen, I go into the beginning of the series one way, but I see playing out the series, and I kind of see how things go, and then I make another bet.
Yeah, well, and so for that strategy, mainly what I've done this first round, save for the Hawks series, because I had an overwhelming amount of confidence in the Atlanta Hawks as that series played out. But in both the Denver and Portland series and the Lakers and Suns series, really what I was just doing was locking in profit just in case something were to happen, right? The Suns-Lakers series, for example, after game 1, took a wager on the Los Angeles Lakers at even money to win that thing. And then after game 3, in which they take a 2-1 series lead, put just enough on the Phoenix Suns that you're making a small amount of profit and your wager back if the Suns were to pull this thing out. So I would have much rather the Lakers would have won that thing. The profit would have been much larger. But either way, you lock in a little bit of something and you mitigate the risk. Same thing with Denver, right? Had Denver before the series started at about plus 112, and then going into those best of sevens after they had won game 5 and took a 3-2 lead, just a little on Portland to just mitigate the loss in case something happens, but still lock in a profit either way. And, that's a good way to handle a lot of these series. Locking in profit and making sure you're coming away with something is the way to go. I know sometimes we get a little greedy. Got a buddy who had the Lakers after game 1 was like, no, Lakers are going to do it. It's fine. And, sure enough, they didn't. And they ended up losing that thing. So I tend to be a little bit safer when it comes to the series bets, unless I have some overwhelming confidence in one side or the other, like I did with Atlanta. And as far as these series are concerned, look, it's funny, like how sports betting works for the most part. Take this Nets and Bucks series, for example. I think the Nets are going to win this series, but I think it's going to be a very tight series. I think it's going to be a 7-game series where if the team is going to win, it has to win on the margins and have the little things go in their favor. But I also think that if that series price reaches about 2-1 on Milwaukee, that there is some value in that, right? If you're telling me in terms of like minus 230, if you're going to tell me that the Nets are winning that series over 7 out of 10 times, I think it's a little high, right? An implied probability of around 70% might be too high considering that these two teams are so closely tight together, at least by my ranking. So while I do think the Nets are going to win, I'm actually sitting back and saying that if Milwaukee reaches 2-1 again on that series price, I'm going to be all in on a price like that because I think the implied probability is a little too low on Milwaukee if you get back to that 2-1.
How do you factor in coaching when it comes to evaluating these series? Because I was thinking about this today. There are 3 head coach openings right now, and all 3 of those coaches were in the postseason just a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So like Steve Nash, 0 coaching experience in the postseason. Budenholzer, a good amount. Doc Rivers won a championship. Ty Lue won a championship, but it was with Cleveland with LeBron, so like we don't really know what that really means. So like, how do you factor in like the coaching aspect when it comes to evaluating these series?
I mean, you have to. I don't know if there's really, to me personally, I don't know if there's a numerical value, right, to a coach, but like take Rick Carlisle, for example. Rick Carlisle is a very big reason. I'd say it's Luka Doncic and Rick Carlisle why the Dallas Mavericks are giving the Los Angeles Clippers such a hard time. If you go back, so we'll go to game 3, right? The end of game 3, and when they're down the Clippers, 30-15 at the beginning, and then they start to make their comeback. One of the things that Ty Lue discovered was, hey, Nick Batum playing 5 actually kind of works for me here. Let's roll with this into game 4. So game 4, they start that lineup. Again, it bothers the Mavericks, and they win that game. So Carlisle, what he does and says, okay, well, for game 5, I'm going to roll out a big lineup with Boban Marjanovic. I'm going to play Max Kleber a lot. We're going to play zone a lot. You're not going to get within 4 feet of the basket like you've been doing the last 2 games. And sure enough, what happens? They end up winning that game. They take a 3-2 lead. So coaches can make a massive difference in a lot of these series, right? Ty Lue, I think still his coaching acumen could be called into question. I think Kawhi Leonard the other night really just kind of bailed the Clippers out with a massive performance. But you're right, coaches will swing series. Look at Michael Malone, for example. Michael Malone, there's no way that game between the Trailblazers and the Nuggets back, I think it was a game 5, you should not have gone to double overtime, right? You foul when you're up 3 like that, and yet Michael Malone didn't twice, and that extends the game. So coaching 100% will change things up. I think you approach it, though, on more of a game-to-game basis in an in-game type scenario. Once you see that Rick Carlisle has made that adjustment, right, then you can go in and feel more confident in-game betting on a Dallas Mavericks, for example. When you see that Michael Malone is not going to foul up 3 at the end of regulation, then going into the other overtime situation, you can feel comfortable maybe really in-game firing on a Portland Trailblazers team to extend that and maybe grab some points. Those are the types of things when it comes to coaching that I think factor more, in-game and watching on a game-to-game basis as opposed to a series.
Obviously, you mentioned the Clippers, Mavs tomorrow. Folks, you hear that game right here on 97.3 ESPN following the Sixers and Hawks game 1. I mean, the road team has won every single game in that series. I see you wearing the Clippers hat. I know you're obviously probably leading a certain way, but I want to ask it this way. Clippers win game 7 if?
Clippers can win game 7 if they shoot the ball relatively well, right? I think if you look at some of their worst performances in this series, right, where their offense has fallen off, you can look at this last game that they just won. The three-point shooting was around 36, 35%. They were missing wide open threes, and then they start to get them knocked down. Kawhi Leonard takes over. He's hitting his own three-point shots, and they end up winning that game. You go back to game 1, in which they were thoroughly beat on their home court. The three-point shots weren't falling. You can go to game 5 where they shot, I think, 36% from 3. This is the team that finished first in three-point shooting in the regular season at 42.1%. They were first in corner three-point shooting. They were first in above the break three-point shooting in terms of percentage. And the three-point shooting has been inconsistent at times in this series. So I would think that would be at the top of the list. The Clippers are winning this game and they're winning this series if their three-point shooting is going to even out and be at the same level that it was throughout the regular season.
Jonathan Von Tobel joining us here on Sports Bash Saturday here on 97.3 ESPN. Of course, the second round of the NBA playoffs starts tonight. Bucks versus Nets. I almost said Celtics. Good grief. Bucks versus Nets here on 97.3 ESPN. So obviously we have almost all the playoff matchups set aside from the Clippers, Mavs having to iron things out tomorrow. So what do you think the conference finals are going to be in each conference right now?
So I think I told you when I was on with you guys right before the series started, my pick before the playoff started was Clippers and Nets in the NBA finals. And when you look at the conference finals and what they could potentially, if my team's still alive, I'll ride with them, right? The guys that I pick. So I think the Clippers can win this series. I think they can move on. I still think they match up well with the Jazz. And I think they find their way to a Western Conference Finals berth against the Phoenix Suns. The Suns, I think, match up really well with Denver. It's funny, Denver, think about that luck, right? Your backcourt's ravaged with injury. You get by in 6 games against Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, and Norm Powell, and now you have Devin Booker and Chris Paul waiting for you. It's just such a terrible matchup for them in that regard. So I think Phoenix, especially now, remember 3 days between the end of that series with the Lakers and game 1 against the Nuggets, that's going to be a good amount of time for Chris Paul to get ready, get right, and heal up a little bit. So I think you're going to get a Suns-Clippers matchup in that Western Conference Finals with the Clippers eventually, taking that and getting to the NBA Finals. I'll stick with that. And then the East, I like that Nets team. I think it's going to be a tight series. Not by any stretch are they going to be comfortable, but a Nets Sixers Eastern Conference Finals would not surprise me in any way whatsoever.
Now, you mentioned Portland a couple times already. I got to ask you about this because I'll talk about it before you came on. This is the strangest head coaching situation I've ever seen in my life. Last year, it was like Alvin Gentry leaves the bubble, fired. Sixers get kicked out of the playoffs. Brett Brown, 2 days later, fired. Just fired this guy fired. And this year it's, Brad Stevens is moving into the front office. There's a coach opening. Terry Stotts and Steve Clifford mutually part ways. There's head coach. Like, the vibe of this coach opening situation is completely opposite of what I was expecting in the NBA. It's like, oh, guys just happen to be leaving jobs. Whereas in the past, it's like, dudes fired left and right.
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, and I think the Stotts thing, it seemed to be wearing pretty thin. I think at the end of last season, too, there were like reports and rumblings that relationship was near an end, and he was kind of a lame duck coach. So it seemed like they were kind of, unless something dramatic had happened this year, right? A Western Conference Finals run yet again, that was kind of reaching its end. And the Trailblazers, by the way, are kind of at a crossroads now, too, right? You know, the rumblings that Damian Lillard could potentially be on the move. Like, we could see a pretty different Portland team by the time we get to next season. So that makes some sense, right? The Magic, for example, I think that's why we get this kind of cohesive vibe with these coaching changes. You know, the Magic too. Magic finally tore everything down this year, right? Traded Nikola Vucevic, traded away Aaron Gordon. So you're finally seeing them, Evan Fournier as well. So they're kind of just going on a different path. Clifford doesn't really vibe with their timeline at that point right now. And then you get the Celtics. The Celtics are weird, right? The Celtics thing is a little different because, look, Brad Stevens is a good coach, right? Is he as good as I think the conversation was around him at his peak? No, right? There was those stupid conversations about you could pick any player or Brad Stevens. Who would you pick? Like he's not that good, but he's good. And he made it to 3 Eastern Conference Finals. But that one seemed to be a mental thing, right? You know, he had the quote that the bubble really took a lot out of him, that he didn't really enjoy the grind of coaching anymore. It is surprising to see him make that leap, but it does seem that all of these coaching situations that we're seeing right now open up, there is this symbiotic vibe because I do think they actually kind of mesh with one another in terms of the directions that they're going.
I'm going to steal a question from my colleague here at 97.3 ESPN, Mike Gill, and I'll ask it to you. Can Brad Stevens find a head coach who's actually as good or better than him for that job?
I don't know if that as good or better. I mean, that's hard, right?
Right.
Sometimes you just stumble into it. You have no idea what you actually got in front of you as a head coach. So I would probably tend to say no, but there's some good coaching candidates out there. You know, I'm a big Kenny Atkinson fan, right? Kenny did a great job with the Brooklyn Nets when he was there. He seemed to be a really solid guy in terms of player development. Is he going to be a guy that is going to be there? Juwan Howard seems to be right, checking all the boxes and making some noise in terms of an NBA coaching gig as well. So I think it's all unique, and it all depends on the right situation. We've seen coaches go to second spots and do a lot better than they did the first time around. So I think the answer is no, just because like the probability, it's just so hard to do that.
I also wouldn't be surprised if Steve Clifford goes to Boston as well because, you know, the defensive mentality and everything that he brings to the table. Boston's going to be the most fascinating one to me just because of the fact that, Jonathan, I don't know what Boston's doing at this point. I thought Danny Ainge did a horrible job of putting a team around Tatum and Brown this year. They gotta answer the Kemba question, right? And we've never seen Brad Stevens run an organization. So I have no idea what that's going to look like. To me, Boston is extremely fascinating. Like you said, Portland just comes down to if Damian Lillard's there or not. If Lillard's there, they go one direction. If he's not there, they go another direction. And then the Magic, I could care less. They're in a rebuild at this point. So, I mean, you might as well chalk them up for the lottery for the next 2 years, then forget about it.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think Boston, because look, I mean, you said the Kemba Walker question. I think it's been answered. It's a bad contract right now. That is something where if you're going to get off of that, you have to trade assets to get off of that. You have to, you know, select or send along maybe a first-round pick or something if someone's going to pick up a contract like that. So that's kind of been answered. They're just kind of in a tight spot there. I will say that there are worse situations to be had than having cornerstones like, you know, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum to build around. But they're in a very bad cap situation, and how they navigate out of that with a first-time executive, I think is really fascinating. And I think that's why a lot of people kind of scratch their heads. You know, this is the first time for Brad Stevens. Sure, he can surround himself with all sorts of smart people, and you know, some reports indicate that it's going to be some of the same Ainge people that might stick around to that front office. And then what was the point? You're kind of rolling with the status quo here. So I am fascinated because there's some things you really like about the Boston gig, and there's some things that you really don't like about it, and how they navigate themselves out of this into contention is going to be fascinating.
He's Jonathan Von Tobel. Follow him on Twitter at MeJVT on Twitter. The podcast is the Hardwood Handicappers podcast. And, of course, like all guests, he appeared right here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Good luck to your Clippers tomorrow. Yeah. Hopefully that works out for you. And the NBA playoffs have given us no reason to not watch, to say the least, so far.
Yep, it's been awesome, man. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.